No, down actually, just to do the next one. So, yeah, that's great. So, and what I do is I just put it onto your top of your pants or in your pocket or something. And that should go there. So you put that where it fits.
You're very interesting on a Monday morning.
And that just goes, yeah, that can just go there.
So is that a microphone or is
It's on, you're on now, yeah.
Okay, right.
Yeah. So I think that light should be on, just there.
Green? Green light?
Yeah.
And that's just recorded.
Introduction.
Yeah, sure.
Oh. I've seen them before, they're lovely. It's a drawing or something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Of course, there's a whole bunch of families came from Moray Mission. You know, it's a very lot of the Munros and all that sort of people are all from the Moray Mission.
Sydney University have lost all the students really. Every student in Moray was going to what's her name, to Sydney University.
Yeah, they've lost their keys. Well, that's Shane Houston, really?
Yeah, compliments of Shane, yeah. Record the whole lot. Oh yes, you're lucky it's being recorded.
Okay. So it's just audio and...
Yeah.
Okay.
So
and they'll connect.
Should just go straight to the video. Do you have the link? If it, it should be fine. Yeah.
It worked on my computer, so I was
Yes, it should be fine. It works on the computer. Oh, Mac, yeah.
No, I worked. Yeah.
See, there we go.
Otherwise, I have to send you off to get my laptop.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just do a bit of an introduction.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Let's get started. Now, just an admin matter. So there will be one lecture next week, week 13. One lecture on the Monday. John DeNoble's doing that on the legal aspects of the profession, and but there won't be any tutes. No workshops next week. Just the lecture. But today, as you can see, we have Dr. Kevin Lowe in here to give today's lecture, and Kevin's from South East Queensland, and has many years of experience working with the New South Wales Board of Studies, and many years of experience as a high school teacher as well. So one of us, so to speak. And worked in TAFE and has recently been appointed as a postdoctoral Indigenous Fellow at Macquarie University, which is a very prestigious position, very competitive, very difficult to get those sort of postdoctoral fellowships in any university around the world these days. So Kevin had a lot of experience and a lot of research background in the area of Indigenous education, and that's probably the main reason why I've asked Kevin to come in and give today's lecture. So also a kind of disconcerting thing for me, I suppose, in being a convener of EDT 403, the PRAC unit, that I see most people weren't including on those the supervisor forms for that observation forms. 2.4 wasn't ticked off for most people. I think there were about 5 that I saw that were ticked off, and I think it's kind of a pity that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures have fallen off the radar in many of the classrooms across New South Wales, and so we're here today, or well, I was here last week, and Kevin and I are here today to try and encourage you to make sure that that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures do get a place in your classroom in future. So thank you very much, Kevin. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm happy to call you colleagues, because even though I guess many of you are at the beginning of your career, the fact that you're here as would-be teachers, about to be appointed teachers, I think is incredibly laudable. And I guess while I'm at the other end of that experience, it was almost 45 years ago that I started teaching, I do remember, believe it or not, I do remember those first few years and what it was like and the challenges to be a first-year art teacher and to negotiate your way around the classroom and negotiate your way around the curriculum. I've given a lot of thought to how best we can be supporting teachers to be the sorts of teachers that I hope that you want to be. And I'm hoping today just to very quickly, and I know this is just going to skim across a lot of issues, but I guess to start to raise some significant issues with you, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to have all the answers, because I don't. And I don't think that in 1 hour it would be good of me to even assume that I could put some solutions to some of these issues, but I do want to draw your attention to them and show you that there are some ways forward. I think it's very important not to leave you disconcerted thinking that there's no way forward, that the issues are so significant that it's impossible to move forward. So as Neil said, my name is Kevin Lowe, and my family come from southeast Queensland. I'm a Gubbi Gubbi man, so although I've never actually lived in Queensland, I've travelled there many times. I grew up in Western New South Wales in a whole bunch of small country towns. So I guess it's strange for me to come here. I should say one more thing, though, is Macquarie University was the first university that I attended in my undergraduate degree program. So I was here in 1971 when there were 6 buildings and about 2,500 students. So you can see, of course, that it's changed a lot since I was here. The title of my presentation, I really want to focus in on the issues around community engagement. And while I've tailored my commentary about community engagement specifically to the issues about how do teachers engage, how do they actually meet the demands, how do they actually develop some skills to understand what it is that Aboriginal communities in particular have to say about the quality of education and what happens in the classroom, I would suggest to you that many of the comments that I make to you are going to be as significant or as important in any school, in any community. Teachers who don't engage with the parents, and especially all primary school teachers, all primary here? Okay. So my daughter, I should just admit that my daughter has just taken up her first appointment as a first-year art teacher at Gwandalin Primary School just up in the Central Coast. So I hear on a at least 2 or 3 times a week basis from my daughter just the challenges of being a first-year art teacher. It takes me back to my own experiences. So I'm very interested in this notion of how to engage with community. And I've subtitled it A Moral Imperative. And while I'm going to talk about the legal requirements and I guess the things that are in place that would encourage you to engage with community and community knowledge, I really want to also suggest to you that those teachers who are effective, those teachers who really go into the school and make that extra effort to engage with the parents and the community are in fact making moral decisions as well as educational decisions. I guess I should just, very quickly obviously point out to you that the Australian professional teaching standards have now started to articulate specifically that you as graduates, teachers, and as you progress your way through the profession at all those levels, are required to make some attempt, well, more than some attempt. You are required to actually engage in a whole bunch of things to actually prove your worth as a teacher. You understand that you guys are under a lot of accountability issues. You're going to be held accountable for what you do in the school, what you do on a day-to-day basis through your teaching and learning, and assessments are made about how you work your way through and can show and demonstrate these skills and capacities. So I put them out here in a sense. I've identified them. You know what they are, or should know what they are. But primarily they ask you to develop knowledge of responsive teaching practices. I'm going to come back to that because it's a very important concept. Knowledge about the particular needs and cultures and the issues around low SES students and communities. An understanding of the culture, identity, history and linguistic background of students, strategies to engage parents and caregivers in education, and an understanding of effective engagement with parents in key community bodies. So they're the sorts of things that you're going to have to sort of demonstrate over time, both as a I guess, in this pre-service stage as you go through your practicums. You start to think about these things, but certainly as you get employed in schools, you're going to be asked to demonstrate and provide evidence that you're doing these things. I've tried to capture some of these things by suggesting to you that there are sort of challenges and conditions and policy programs. And I assume that most of you know that this presentation will be made available. Is that what you do? So you can download this. So rather you just listen and maybe just make some side notes, your own thoughts about things. In particular, I wanted to sort of identify that we are actually talking about partnerships for learning. It goes to the next question about what do we actually mean by partnerships, engagement, and what does it actually mean? Now I imagine that most of you start off teaching, as my daughter has in a year 1-2 class. She has quite a regular interaction with parents coming to school. You know from your own experiences, both in practicums and as a student, that parents tend to be fairly significantly involved in schooling in those first few years of schooling, and it peters off. So when I'm talking about engagement, and I'm also talking about both primary and secondary school here, I'm not actually meaning that you're going to have parents, I'm suggesting you would have parents in the back of your classroom all the time, observing and witnessing what you do in the classroom. It's about the sort of relationship you build with these people. Some of that stuff is going to be face-to-face, and I'm going to suggest to you that that face-to-face interaction is absolutely critical. But there's other things that you need to do along the way. Why I suggest this to you is that in most schools, and Australia is no different to many Western European countries, education and teachers has often been representative of either aspiring working class families who are putting their kids through education and through university to move up, I guess, the levels of society, or those in the middle class who see teaching and education as a very laudable activity. Why I say that to you is because teachers tend to represent and are representative of a cultural milieu in which they grew up in. They understand, in a sense, what white middle class Australia looks like. So when you go into a school where there's lots of other blue-eyed, blonde-haired children, while their parents may or may not come to school, you have a fairly good idea of what that culture is that's represented in front of you. You have a pretty good understanding of what the aspirations of those parents are. I would suggest to you that most middle-class Australia, and a lot of working-class Australia, has a conversation with their child almost in utero, which is about educational success. Most families would see education as being a primary vehicle for long-term socioeconomic success. So while I'm not suggesting to you that every child is going to succeed and get to university, nor in fact is that necessarily a good thing in itself, that's a conversation I would suggest most parents have as an aspiration for their child, that they will do well, that if all of stars are aligned, my son or daughter will come out as a doctor or as a lawyer or something like that. That typically is the aspiration for many middle-class families. And that's the aspiration that you put on those kids who are in front of you. You don't have to have that conversation with them. You intuitively understand that that's what their parents are thinking. So the question for you is, what happens when the children who are in front of you don't necessarily have the same direct aspirations or cultural understanding or historical experiences that you have? How do you actually understand what their aspirations are? Because their kids are going to represent what those families are talking about. So this lecture, very quickly, is to sort of, in a sense, try to walk you through some of those imperatives and why you need to start to engage with them. These are the critical things that I'm thinking about, that partnerships are about learning. Clearly, it's about how do you affect the learning space as a teacher and its impact on students' outcomes. That partnerships need to align to both the school and the home practices, such that you enable parents to become actively involved. So when you as a teacher send students home with homework, what is the automatic assumption that you would make? I would suggest to you, most of you would think that the kids are going to go home and somebody's going to be there to supervise and support the child. That there's going to be the technology that you're probably going to be assuming is available to them, such that they can have a computer, they've got a printer, they've got the internet, and they've got a space in which they can work. That there's somebody at home who can assist them if they need assistance in terms of interpreting the instructions that you've given them. The partnerships underpin a two-way learning process. So how is it that that teacher who goes to a school where there is a cultural disconnect between the teacher and the students in front of them, how do you bridge that gap? Or alternatively, are you going to be the teacher who will insist that while the kids are in the classroom, that they're going to do your bidding? That is, that they will assume all of the attributes that you assume students need to have, and if they don't meet those, then you'll deal with them as management issues about the children's behaviour or about their learning. So I think that when we're talking about partnerships, you need to see that one of the significant outcomes for you as a teacher is that partnerships gives you the capacity to start to get genuine interaction between you and the parents to get some understanding about what's going on in their home. And the partnerships need to acknowledge the community standpoint. That is, what I mean by standpoint is what the community understands of themselves. Now, I don't want to actually draw anyone's attention to anything significant or any particular group of people within Australia. But you would appreciate that when we're talking about that disconnect, maybe it's seen significantly in where you get recent arrivals. So my own experiences in the very early post-war period in the 1950s, massive migration into Australia from Europe, from all over Europe. So my classroom was full of kids from Germany, from Italy, from Greece, and so on and so forth. Now, most of those parents in the 1950s, the oppression, I guess, of Australian identity and the need for students to assimilate into the Australian environment meant that often parents changed their surnames. They anglicised their names to obviate any sort of drawing attention to their child in the school or themselves in the workplace. In a sense, there was a process of cultural denial to assimilate into the Australian environment so that they could get ahead. That process has left a significant legacy, and one which we're still actually grappling as Australians today in how to deal with the migration issues. You understand, of course, that I saw in the paper today, Sydney's going to have another 2.1 million people jam-packed into this city in the next 15 to 20 years. Now, putting aside the issue of where and how, but you understand that a lot of those people are going to be recent migrants into this country. So the questions for you as classroom teachers is, increasingly your classrooms are going to be less monocultural and more multiculturally in focus. So how are you going to get an understanding of what the history is? Some of the attributes, I guess, of collaboration. So relationships are underpinned by circumstances of context. So trying to understand that you need to understand the context of the places you teach. So my daughter's gone from the entrance to Gwendolyn. That's only about 20 k's away. Well, it's even less than that, probably 15 k's away. But there is some significant changes between being on the coast and being basically what was a mining town. Gwendolyn was a mining town. So she's got to sort of start to think about, what does that mean? What's the history of this place? Who are the families that I need to be connecting with? Can I just ask a bit of a straw poll here? Did anybody grow up and go to school west of the Blue Mountains? Okay. So that's not surprising. That's a common answer. I've even asked them sometimes, a bit more cheeky, a bit more time, who's actually travelled past Bathurst, and found that there's only a small handful of people who've ever been past what is basically a pretty eastern regional centre. The fact remains is that a lot of teachers have a very narrow focus in terms of their life experiences. And that's not a criticism, that's just a reality. So what happens, I'm going to talk about this a bit later on, what happens if you're appointed to a school in a regional or rural or even a remote school? How are you going to deal with that? So relationships actually help you develop the skills and knowledge and understanding required to live and work in the communities that you're going to be appointed into. One of the things about relationships is that it helps you as teachers start to understand how some of the preconceptions that you have as teachers and also the community has about itself around its own particular deficits. Now, I would suggest to you, I'm going to mention this suburb only because I lived there myself for a little while. If someone gets appointed to Kalara Primary School, or I could have picked up any number of schools here, you would, first thing that would come to mind is that you're going to go basically into a reasonably wealthy, affluent community. The kids are going to have the support and the aspirations and the resources that you would expect that they would need to be a successful student. If you get appointed to Nyngan Primary School, another school that I was appointed to many years ago, anyone know where Nyngan is? Where is it?
Northwest of New South Wales.
Northwest, about 170 kilometres west of Dubbo, on the way to Bourke. Great little town. If you get an opportunity to go west, get into those small rural towns. They are awesome to teach in, just by the way. That's a bit of a plug for rural education. I remember that, and I had many teachers who were in their first appointment going to schools like Nyngan and any other schools like that. And often the fear of being appointed to those schools, the drive out, you remember you're sort of driving out, once you go past Dubbo, you get an extra week's holiday. Well, you used to, I think they were called the Western Line. So you get an extra week's holiday. You're driving out in the heat, and sometimes it's absolutely stultifying heat. You're driving out, the windows are up, the air conditioner's trying to do its best to keep you cool, and you're looking at this stark environment. They've just cut all the wheat, so it looks like you're going into a desert because everything is low cut and there's no grass, and the trees are wilting under the heat. There's a fear that often comes when going out into these communities that you're going out into a wasteland. Now, the fact is, reality is you're not. But often people take those conceptions with them. And part of that is about the sort of things that you're going to expect is going to see when you get there. What sort of school am I going to find myself in? Who are these people? What are they going to be doing? Do I know anything about them? What do their parents do? So part of this relationship building is actually for you to really start to challenge those conceptions about who you are. I just put this here just because I think that sometimes it's important. You'll see all these terms. Any reading you'll see that there is a whole bunch of words. Collaboration, participation, cooperation, engaging. They're all sort of, in a sense, metaphors for something. And they're all about some of the activities of you as teachers and about your personal interactions. But the most important thing I think you need to remember is that partnerships is, in a sense, if nothing else, it's about having a vision of yourself as a teacher. How are you as a teacher going to engage with these kids in this classroom? How are you going to be the teacher you want to be? I've never met a teacher yet who said, you know what, I want to be a really crappy teacher. I couldn't care less about these kids in the classroom. I'm just going to get paid every fortnight, I'm going to have a great time, and then I'm going to bugger off. Now, I've never heard a teacher say that. Most of you, if not all of you, have a deep-seated passion about wanting to be a really, really good teacher. And often you'll have a model in mind about who this teacher's going to be. That teacher who is really effective for you. That person who really cared about you. The person who really challenged you. The person who was interested in your welfare, interested in your educational success. That's okay. I did the same. I mean, all the teachers I went to school with are all World War II veterans who went to war as 18, 19, 20-year-olds. So imagine these guys came back, they were pretty tough. By the time they were teaching me, when they were in their mid-20s, late 20s, they'd been through a whole 4 years of the World War. Some of them had been captured and lived in prisoner war camps. So their understanding of what engagement meant was a bit different to what I'm suggesting to you. They ruled by the rule of a cane. But that didn't matter. By the time I got to year 12, I actually understood these people were real human beings who really were interested. They just had a different mindset. One was growing up in the 1930s. But it is important to understand that whatever words you're going to use, whatever sort of concept you have about this process of engagement, it is about, in fact, starting from a point of having a vision about you as a teacher. What it is you know and what it is you want to do. Another word that I'm using there is the word authentic or authenticity. And I suggest that all of us, while that's a really interesting word and it can mean lots of things, most of you would understand. You might not we use the word authentic, but who hasn't been in a situation where you've had a meeting with somebody, whether it's at a school with the principal or the year advisor, whether it's with someone at the university here, whether it's someone you're going for a job, and you've walked out the door and you thought, that person did not listen to anything I had to say. They had already preconceived what they were going to do. They didn't want to employ me. This was just the process of actually going through to say they've employed someone. Or alternatively, that person really listened. I walked away and felt that I had a fair hearing. It might not have been the result I wanted, but I had a fair hearing to put my point of view. That's what the concept of authenticity is, in the sense, have they actually treated you appropriately? I want to basically linger here just for a moment, because I said it in the beginning that the notion of engaging with parents has at its heart a moral imperative. And part of that is about you, and part of it is about the job you do. So part of it is about you as a teacher and your own self-efficacy. That is, what is it that you want to be? Have you sat down and thought? Have you actually committed to writing the sort of teacher you want to be? I'd suggest that all of you would really should spend 5 minutes at least thinking about that. If you haven't already, in the shower, when you're walking up from the station up to the university, on the weekend, when you're mindlessly doing something, think about the person you want to be. The other point about this is that engagement at its heart has a social justice imperative to it. You would think that teachers, being in the social environment that we are in as teachers, would look to get as much support as possible to the task that we have to educate these students. And yet why is it that education and teachers have historically basically walled parents off? We have constructed a sense of ourselves as experts. All of a sudden, we become experts. After 4 years of being in these hallowed halls, we go out as an expert educator. And of course, parents know nothing. Or if they know things, often it's seen to be a disadvantage to what happens in the classroom. Now, why is that? It's a quandary that I've always thought about. And the third issue about this moral imperative is this notion of sovereign legitimacy. So I'm going to come back to my own community, this notion of Indigenous people. One of the greatest issues, and I've suggested and I've argued before, that one of the greatest social, moral imperatives of this country is to how it actually in the end comes to terms with the Indigenous populations of this place. And so if you're a reader of the paper, you may well have read over the weekend and heard on the news about the conversations that have been going on in Uluru just this last weekend about how Indigenous Australians want to move forward in terms of constitutional recognition and having some process that properly legitimates Indigenous prior occupation. So one of the questions that you as teachers have to work in is this space of sovereign legitimacy. How are you going to teach these big issues to kids? Now you're going to say, well, I'm a primary school teacher, it's not my job. There are students in the next few years who will be leaving as this school system, and think of yourself. Think of your own experiences for a second. How many Year 12 students who are 18 could vote on a referendum on the constitutional changes to recognise Indigenous Australians based on what they had learnt from school? What did you learn at school that you think would equip you with the skills and the knowledge to really vote in an informed way about that really big issue? Now I'd argue that basically that for most students, virtually they would have nothing that they could draw on. Very little that they could draw on to say we spent time in class thinking about these issues. Yet this question goes to the moral legitimacy of this state. How does this state, Australia, see itself, and how does it project itself both internally and externally while it's still unable to come to terms with its Indigenous populations? So you as teachers are starting to prepare students for that debate and for the world that that debate is going to then move into. So think about that. I know there's a lot of text on here, so I've only just underlined some parts of it. But I've drawn some text directly from the Australian curriculum for no purpose other than just to sort of show you that right at the top end, even though I've criticised the Australian curriculum in lots of places, but at its, I guess, symbolic place, it makes some big statements. And primarily it says that curriculum is going to be, so you as teachers of curriculum are going to assist students to learn about the histories and cultures of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and their contributions, so on and so forth. And to promote the importance of pursuing, so for Aboriginal students in particular, if you've got Aboriginal kids in your school, in your classroom, in front of you, your job, it says, the CARA curriculum, is that your job is going to be such exemplary teachers that you're going to promote their success through having this educational experience through this curriculum. Cross-curriculum priorities identifies, of course, that it's something that contemporary issues that you as teachers are going to be teaching all students about the history and the cultures and the languages and the experiences of Indigenous people. That's your task. I've put this up here so you can have a look at. So you know that, of course, the Australian curriculum is constantly changing. If you were trying to map what's happened on the Australian curriculum, virtually from month to month there's minor changes, new iterations, and now we're on version 8.3, is that right? 8.3? This was done on 8.2, I think, or 8.1, and that was only late last year. Here's the mapping, and I've just done some mapping of all the content in the history, geography, English, maths and science curriculum. Those 5 areas in the primary school account for about 75% of all your teaching, those 5 areas. You can see that I've identified, this is from, and I don't know why I could not get that to read properly, but basically it's from kinder through to year 10. So you can see the last column is a total, I think, and the one before that is year 10 work backwards. The point I'm trying to make is that really there's very little content in the Australian curriculum that helps you start to address some of the really big issues. How are you going to teach kids about history and culture and languages of Indigenous Australia, both prehistory and in contemporary times? That's the mapping of all of the mandatory curriculum in the Australian curriculum. And have a look at the issues which aren't addressed, which I think is always interesting. The things that the Australian curriculum, which CARA doesn't want you to teach about. So they don't want you to teach about terra nullius. It doesn't exist. They don't want you to teach about self-determination. That is, the capacity of Aboriginal people to actually do things for themselves, to actually address their own issues like Uluru. You couldn't teach Uluru, what was happening last weekend, if you were looking for content in the Australian curriculum. Or about autonomy, or about sovereignty, or about land rights, or about racism, or all about social justice. There are terms which do not exist within the Australian curriculum. So your challenge as a teacher is to teach stuff that's not there about kids that you don't understand. That's a bit of a challenge. I'm hoping this is going to work because I've dropped in some video here. But can I suggest to you at some stage or other, I mean, Neil did say, I worked for 12 years in the Board of Studies and we did a lot of work trying to help and support teachers in the classroom. So not only did I was working on curriculum itself, but actually working on curriculum implementation. One of the things we did when I was there was to work on trying to develop resources about helping people just like you to actually go and engage with kids, with parents. And I'm not going to go through the whole process because this basically is an hour-long presentation. But it's freely available on the board's website. So the address is up there. If you go to that address up there, you can watch the whole presentation in parts, and there's a book that goes with it. I'm going to just quickly look at the first one, which is about building on the aspirations. The first point of call for you as a teacher to actually get out and start to engage with kids, engage with the kids in your classroom, to actually understand who they are, what they know, what they can do, and how you're going to actually work with them on their learning. Not just you as the person who's trying to shove things into a bottle, but actually listen to what they, and respond to what they're doing in the classroom. And also the parents is to have an aspiration. Remember I said at the beginning, if you don't have a vision of you as a teacher, you cannot do any of this. You can't do this. Why would you do it if you don't have a vision for where you want to go? This presentation looks at all the issues around those things to answer that central question about enhancing community engagement. So we're looking about basically about collaboration. The first thing you need to do is, so I've used the word collaboration, but I could have used the word partnerships. But the notion of collaboration is, what do you actually mean by it? I've thought a lot about this, and one of the issues about collaboration often is that teachers have an understanding what collaboration means. And put it in a nutshell, often it means getting the parents to do the work of the teacher because the teacher can't do it for themselves. So if a kid's not turning up with pens and pencils, or doesn't come with a uniform on, or comes with a bad attitude, or anything else, you're hoping that these parents, you can dragoon these parents to do the work that you could be doing, to actually engage these kids in the classroom and get them to do your work for you. So why else do we ring parents up and say, listen, Neil, can you come up, little Kevin's mucking up in class, I want you to come along and tell him he has to behave. That's basically what happens in all of those parent interviews when someone's mucking up, that's the conversation. And the parent says, well, hang on a minute, what are you doing as a teacher? What are you teaching? Are you teaching something that's relevant? Do you actually understand this kid? You said this in the classroom. Look where you've positioned him in the classroom. Why is it that Kevin and all the other Aboriginal kids are in the bottom 2 classes in Year 7? How does that happen? I'm getting into something else here, but I'm talking about resistance. If those parents are resisting you as a teacher because they think that basically your teaching is suspect and you don't engage with the kids, are they going to come and be your supporter? I don't think so. Collaboration really means you have to actually work out, what am I putting on the table here to collaborate with these people? You have to identify a need. So parents are busy people. Think of yourself, hand up all these people who are already parents in here. A few. You got spare time to just go up to school and have a bit of a nap to the teacher? No. Exactly, all the time. So unless something is really purposeful, unless they're saying, I want you to come and work with us on something that's actually going to be of benefit to my child, or at least to the class, and it's something I want to know about, I'm out of it. Why would I come? So a need is important. You need to actually understand about what you're going to look to try to achieve and articulate what you want to achieve. The rest comes from it. Some of the strategies, I'm not going to go through all these, but there's a whole bunch of things you need to do. Collaboration isn't just about meeting someone at the front door and shaking hands and saying we're collaboration. Okay, you need to really think about it. It's like any business arrangement. You need to actually think about it as a business. There's a whole bunch of things in here which are really important that you need to actually understand. I'm running out of time now, I know. I'm hoping this is going to work.
With previous programs that we have run to increase our participation of Aboriginal families have really not been successful in having real engagement of families and real engagement of students. And yet that hasn't been the case with this program. So we were looking to do something that we thought was achievable, significant, and something that would bring about change. And this program has done that for us.
I should have said, these 3 little videos, they're very, very short. They're all part of this bigger project, but they're all taped of people, practitioners in the classroom and the Aboriginal education assistants in schools who've been working with us and their community and their school for about 4 or 5 years on a range of projects. There's several schools. I've just picked out one for the moment. So this is a little school. It's a rural school about 70 kilometres north of Dubbo, on the way to Galagambar and on the way to Walgett. Around about 300 kids. Had gone from about 15% Aboriginal enrolment over a very short period of time, about 5 years, it had gone up to 30%. So already there's starting to be some significant changes. One of the things, of course, about rural Australia is it's been a long process of what they call white flight. So often white families either are deserting small country rural towns or at least sending their kids away to either bigger centres or to Sydney or to some other place as a boarding student. What's left behind often is a residual group of low SES families who can't afford to do those things and Aboriginal families who stick with public education come hell or high water. So this is the principal. Commenting about, well, maybe I'll draw it towards the end. He was the principal at the school.
During my teaching career, I've taught
The maths head teacher.
Indigenous children, and I've had this strong belief that we hadn't been catering for their different learning styles, and we were imposing on them learning curriculums, criteria that they couldn't cope with. And often they were the child that was left in the back of the classroom, who at the end of the year you thought, now have I really achieved anything? And their learning was not positive for them. So I thought going into this project would be a positive way to put some of my beliefs and ideas into practice. When we first started the project, we were a bit daunted by why we were chosen, but then we realistically looked at it and thought, yes, there is a need for us to do something with Indigenous children. Two of the challenges were getting the community on side. Prior to doing this project, the only contact, the major contact that the community had with our school was when their child was in trouble.
Harry Langus, who was a maths head teacher there, was born in that town. He came from a family who were Dutch refugees, just post late 1940s. Ended up in a small country town. His mum and dad spoke only Dutch in the home. He grew up in town, went to school in that town, went away, did training, went to study his first 5 or 10 years in another school, came back, and he's been at that school for about 25 years. He knew everybody in that town. So making the connections, of course, was a lot easier for him, but also he had a more intuitive understanding as a child from a refugee family about the need, one about marginalised groups and also about the need to actually sort of engage more broadly.
Yeah, I think at first it was the maths, because we pushed it was a maths program. It scared a lot of the parents. They wanted it to happen, they knew it was a good thing, but as for involvement, they weren't too keen. So until we sort of said, no, the maths part will be looked after mainly by the maths teachers. We want you because we need a cultural aspect of it. And that's when they sort of become more comfortable, I think, as time went on and the projects went on and being involved.
And the two AEOs, which are the Aboriginal Education Officers or AEAs, assistants, in the school, commenting about the fact that you can participate and collaborate even on something that you yourself don't necessarily have the skills or knowledge to do. So we were doing a maths project with those kids in those communities. They said, we didn't know about the maths. We were really frightened of maths. Maths, if you've looked at the outcomes, you would know, any of the NAPLAN results, that Aboriginal kids in particular do really poorly at numeracy. So while their literacy levels are poor, their numeracy skills are even worse. So stories from the field, what are these aspirations? So just quickly, what did you hear? Peter, remember, who was the principal, so he had to admit, the first thing he had to do as a principal is admit, and he'd been there a fair while, that the previous programs they'd put in place hadn't worked. Often, it's very hard for people to actually say that and to acknowledge that. Because there's always, if you go into a school and say, why aren't you engaging with parents? They will say, well, yeah, we don't get many people come to the parents' meetings, but it's always in the end their fault. We do all these things, we run all these things, we have sausage sizzles for them, we do this and this and this, they don't turn up. Therefore, obviously it's their fault. We provide the opportunity, if they don't come, that's their problem. Harry was aware that he's teaching, his own teaching. So I'm looking at things that you had to admit himself. And he was a very good, competent teacher. But admitting that he as a teacher and he as a head of a faculty, that his teachers weren't catering for the particular learning needs of these kids. So it's actually sort of putting it out there and having to be what we call reflexive about acknowledging your own weaknesses. And Tanya, of course, talking about community reluctance. Some of the key things of teaching, understanding key messages. Okay, so students, families, and the cultural positioning. How do you connect and understand and acknowledge these kids' histories? very, very quickly, 1 minute. Teacher appointed to Menindee Central School. So they came from Sydney, they flew out to Broken Hill, they got a car or a bus and they went out to Menindee. They got themselves into a teacher flat, they walked in the door, and first day they walked into the classroom. That could be you in a couple of years' time, that could be you. What did they know about that community? What did they know about the people who are living? It's only 400 people in the whole town. There's about a third of them are white families, mainly old, who've come off the land, off property owners who've bought a little house on the river, and all the rest are Aboriginal families who are much younger, lots of kids. The school is around about 80% Aboriginal student enrolment. The other 20% are kids of teachers who go to the school. They knew nothing, and these teachers know nothing about that school, where the mission was, where the families had come from, where they were connected to, what language they spoke. Being aspirational to be this effective teacher, I really can't say this often enough to you. You need to have an idea in your own head of what your aspirations are going to be for yourself. And understand that your fundamental beliefs and attitudes construct your sense of being the professional teacher. You make decisions on a day-to-day basis. From the time you walk out of the staff room as you walk to the classroom, you're making decisions about things that are going to happen in your classroom based on your sort of inner sense of beliefs and attitudes. And if your inner sense of beliefs and attitudes are based in the unreality of these kids' lives, then I'm going to suggest to you that the decisions you make aren't going to be very good. I'm going to come and show you how that folds out. I'm going to pass those. I hope you can read that. This is a little paper which you can get a copy of yourself, and actually I might give it to you, Neil, so you can post it. It's a paper I did with a teacher who, a bit like my colleagues out the front out here, a little bit older, going their first appointment as a teacher as a late 30s, early 40s-year-old, had already had world life experiences, and I don't know if I'm describing you guys, got a couple of kids. She decided she wanted her kids, who was taken from the comfort of Ballina, and she wanted to give them an experience of west of the mountains. So she took her family, including her husband, to this little country town. He had to give his job up and look after the kids. But she had a vision of what she wanted to do. She was a music teacher in a central school of around about 100 kids, K-12. So she talks about basically here, you can read it and I'm not going to read it to you, but they're just extracts from the paper. I really suggest you read the paper because it's about a person just like you, just like you. But she talks about teaching at the cultural interface. That is basically arriving at this place and virtually wanting to be this. She had thought about this. She said, I wrote down the sort of teacher I wanted to be. I really sort of started to articulate my vision for myself as a teacher. But she's arrived at this school, and all the things that she thought she was going to do as a teacher very, very quickly came to naught. All of the sorts of strategies that she thought that she knew as a mature-aged adult with kids of her own, why wouldn't she understand these kids in the classroom if she basically was a parent herself? So, she talks about having this vision of being this teacher. And I suggest to you, most of you will have a vision of some sort. She had this aspiration of wanting to build relationships, to be inspiring, to be enthusiastic, to lead the kids. She was very sort of, this music teacher, wanted to get in there and have this wonderful experience with kids. This might be you. She thought she had a really good knowledge of the curriculum and she could play instruments. She was going to bring all this wonderful culture to these kids. The fact was that these kids didn't respond as she imagined they should. In fact, these kids played up. They resisted from day one. They wouldn't do anything that she wanted. Going into that classroom was like a living hell. Right? It was hard work. I thought, she says, I went into this school and I thought I knew these things. I thought I had all these skills and my enthusiasm would just fill the room. And that enthusiasm would just all of a sudden, the kids would be swept up and they'd want to be doing the sort of things that I thought they could do. If you read the whole paper, she talks about some things that she did as on weekends and in the afternoon, trying to meet people, and the fact that people just sort of didn't acknowledge her really. She said, basically, I continued to operate completely from within my own lens and my own comfort zone, my own understanding of the world. It was so powerful, you know, as a woman in her early 40s, as being a mother, as coming from a particular location, that it was very difficult to change her mindset. She could not reach these kids. And these kids, one thing would be nice if they just were quiet, but they weren't quiet. They were playing up. Everybody understood there was this riot going on in the classroom. You know, so she was really challenged as to, am I going to survive this at all? Lots of teachers don't survive. I hate to say that, but they don't. They disappear. And then many a teacher who's gone in a small country town and disappeared overnight. She then goes on and talks about the sort of epiphany that happens sometimes. She was very lucky. She had a colleague who was working very quietly next door. He's an art teacher. And was getting these amazing results out of the very same kids. So go from her classroom to his classroom. They'd sit down, they'd get their pens and papers out, and they'd start doing all his artwork. And she was intrigued, more than intrigued. She was really needed to know what was happening. And he talked to her and talked to her till such time as she understood she needed to change her mindset about what she thought she knew. And she talks about in the paper about, in the end, the liberation of actually throwing off the curriculum. Not in the sense of just throwing it out the door and doing colouring in, but actually understanding that she needed to really change the structure of what was going on in her classroom, to do something else. And she talks about what then flowed from that. And she says, look, don't get me wrong, it didn't mean that every day wasn't challenging, but I started to get somewhere with these kids. I started to make a difference with these kids. No, that didn't work very well. Just some barriers, quickly, very quickly. The barriers to engagement. You know, so basically talking about parental experience of education. So Aboriginal parents tell you this all the time. Their own experience of education has been so poor that their own beliefs and attitudes have been rooted in something which has been very negative. They start from the assumption that you're not going to be able to engage with them and understand them. So there's a lack of skills. And that skills, in a sense, is the capacity, the skills that, like Tanya and we're talking about, and Mary were talking about, the skills to even become involved in school in a simple maths program. They felt they didn't have the skills to do that. Practical issues such as work commitments. These are things that you need to understand the realities of. So I think your parents can just come up and be, you know, join your committee and do stuff during work hours is unreal. Your own attitudes of the child, and also parents not being interested in the school itself. This notion, as one of the parents kept on saying to me all the time, the school not only was practically locked off from us, but metaphorically locked from us. We didn't go past the front gate because we weren't welcome into the school. And things about parental involvement, which comes from, this is in a sense, the positives. Good parental involvement does actually lead to these sorts of things. And look, it can be the most amazingly positive process for you as a teacher, you as a pedagogue, and you as a sort of a person of social change. In terms of resources, you know, we did produce a lot of resources. I suggest to you, look, these are ones which specifically talk about school engagement. All right, so the one here, this whole thing, working with Aboriginal communities, it's a whole booklet which you can read through, very simply written for teachers, about how to actually get out and start to work with Aboriginal parents in particular. So just a very simple little book. Other resources, things, so part of it is about knowledge. What do I actually know about the history of this country? This one here is over here, Journey's Just Begun, which is the actual where those videos came from. And I guess hopefully you're all familiar with the resources, the significant resources on the board's website, hundreds of teaching programs, and they're all been written from a perspective that allows you to show how you can engage with parents on a day-to-day basis. And this is a primary one which I put in there for you. These are a bit old now, but the actual processes themselves and teaching strategy. So the curriculum links won't be as